There is a moment, 40 minutes into a film released in the autumn of 2018, where a packed cinema audience stops watching a movie and starts attending a concert. The lights on screen shift. A crowd of 72,000 people at Wembley Stadium comes into focus, and a man in a white tank top and denim, fist raised, walks toward a microphone stand, as if he's about to address the entire world at once. For the next 20 minutes, that cinema audience does something strange. They stop being an audience. They start clapping along. Some of them stand up. Some of them cry. Nobody in that room ever saw Freddie Mercury perform live. Most of them were not alive when he did. And yet something in that recreation reached across 4 decades and made total strangers feel, for a few minutes, like they belonged to a stadium crowd in London in the summer of 1985. That film was Bohemian Rhapsody. It would go on to earn more money worldwide than any music biopic in history, over $900 million, a number so far beyond what anyone in Hollywood expected that studio executives spent the following 2 years trying to understand what had actually happened. And once they thought they understood it, they did what studios always do when something works. They tried to do it again, and again, and again. Within 18 months, there was a film about Elton John, told as a fever dream of sequins and swimming pools. Then Elvis Presley, reimagined through the eyes of the man who exploited him. Then Whitney Houston, then Bob Marley. Then Johnny Cash's story got a second life in the cultural conversation, decades after its own biopic first appeared. Then just this year, Michael Jackson, played by his own nephew, opened in cinemas around the world and immediately became the second highest grossing music biopic ever made, trailing only Freddie Mercury's film itself. Bob Dylan got his film. Bruce Springsteen got his. Somewhere in a studio office right now, there is almost certainly a script about another musician who died decades ago, waiting for financing, waiting for the right actor, waiting for its own turn at the kind of resurrection that Freddie Mercury's story pulled off first and best. Tonight we are going to spend some time with that resurrection. Not the tabloid version of Freddie Mercury's life, not the parts of his story that were already picked over 1,000 times before he had even been gone a year. Instead, we are going to sit with a stranger, quieter question. Why did we need him back? Why 35 years after his death did an entire industry decide that the way to make audiences feel something in a darkened cinema was to resurrect a man who spent his life demanding to be looked at and give him one more stage? And why has that same instinct now been applied to nearly every major musical icon of the 20th century, one after another, like a genre discovering it has finally found its subject matter? If you are here to drift off, that is exactly what this is for. There is no urgency in anything we are about to talk about. Freddie Mercury's story does not need you awake for its ending. Most of you already know it, in outline if not in detail. So let your shoulders drop from wherever they have crept up to. Unclench your jaw. If you are lying down, notice the weight of your body sinking slightly further into whatever is holding it. There is nothing you need to do right now except listen. And if listening turns into not listening, into the soft blur before sleep, that is not a failure of attention. That is the entire point of being here. My voice is going to stay low and steady for the next hour or so, tracing a story that has been told and retold so many times that by the end of it, some part of your mind may simply let go of the need to follow it closely at all. If this is your first time here, this channel exists for exactly this purpose. Long, calm, spoken stories about the people and cultural moments that have shaped the world we live in, narrated slowly enough to carry you towards sleep rather than keep you from it. There is no music behind my voice, and there will be no sudden shifts in tone or volume tonight. Just a steady, unhurried telling, the way a decades-old story might be told in the dark by someone who has told it many times before and is in no rush to reach the end. If you find this kind of listening helpful, subscribing costs nothing and simply means the next story finds you more easily whenever you next need something like this to fall asleep to. There is no pressure in that either. For now, just settle in, and let's begin. To understand why Bohemian Rhapsody hit as hard as it did, you first have to understand what the music biopic looked like before it. For decades, films about musicians followed something close to a formula. A troubled genius rises from difficult beginnings. Fame arrives, and with it, excess. There is a spiral, usually drugs, usually a betrayed spouse or lover, usually a rock bottom staged for maximum dramatic effect. Then, if the film wants to end on hope, some kind of redemption. If it wants to end on tragedy, an early death, filmed with the particular reverence Hollywood reserves for real people who can no longer object to how they are portrayed. Walk the Line did this for Johnny Cash. Ray did this for Ray Charles. Both were well-made, well-acted, respected by critics. Both also felt, to many audiences, faintly interchangeable with each other. Swap the wardrobe and the soundtrack, and you could almost transplant one film's plot into the other's timeline. Freddie Mercury's story had all the ingredients for that same formula. Immigrant childhood in Zanzibar in India, a family that fled political upheaval, an outsider's adolescence in England, a meteoric and improbable rise to the top of a notoriously difficult industry, a life increasingly defined by excess once he got there, and a death from AIDS-related complications in 1991, at the peak of a stigma around that illness that most people alive today can barely imagine. Every element of the rise, fall, tragic end formula was sitting right there, ready to be assembled into another respectable but forgettable prestige biopic. Instead, the filmmakers behind Bohemian Rhapsody made a choice that turned out to be the single most important structural decision in the modern history of the genre. They built the entire film not toward Freddie Mercury's death, but toward a concert. Specifically, toward Live Aid, the July 1985 charity broadcast watched by an estimated crowd of billions of people around the world, in which Queen performed for a little over 20 minutes and, by near universal consensus among critics and musicians who study these things, gave one of the greatest live performances in the history of popular music. The film does not end with Freddie Mercury's death. It barely touches it. It ends with him alive, at the absolute height of his powers, commanding a stadium and a global broadcast audience simultaneously, radiating a kind of joy that the rest of the film had suggested, without ever quite saying it. He rarely got to feel in his private life. This was, depending on who you ask, either a betrayal of the truth or the smartest storytelling decision anyone made in Hollywood that decade. Critics who wanted a searching, honest account of a complicated man's life were frustrated by a film that seemed to flatten his sexuality, compress his diagnosis timeline for dramatic convenience, and generally smooth over anything that might complicate the emotional arc toward that final concert. Some of Freddie Mercury's own former bandmates and friends pushed back on how certain relationships were portrayed. Music critics pointed out, accurately, that the film simplified band dynamics that were, in reality, far messier and more collaborative than the film's central conceit of Freddie as the singular, tortured genius surrounded by a more level-headed band. But here's the thing that all of that critique, however fair, missed about what the film was actually doing. Bohemian Rhapsody was never really trying to be a documentary about a man. It was trying to be a documentary about a feeling. The feeling of being in a room, or a stadium, or a cinema seat, while something larger than any individual performer takes hold of a crowd and does not let go. And it turns out that feeling, that specific feeling of collective transcendence, is something audiences in 2018 were unusually hungry for. It's worth pausing, too, on a detail that rarely makes it into the tidy origin story people now tell about Bohemian Rhapsody's success. Because the film's path to the screen was, itself, considerably messier and more uncertain than its eventual box office triumph would suggest. The project had been in development for years before it was finally made, passing through different directors, different actors attached and then unattached to the lead role, different studios weighing whether a film about a rock band, built around a frontman who had died of AIDS-related illness decades earlier, was truly a commercially viable prospect at all. At various points, Sacha Baron Cohen was attached to play Freddie Mercury, before departing the project over reported creative disagreements with the surviving members of Queen about how frankly the film should address certain aspects of Freddie's life and death. A disagreement that, in hindsight, foreshadowed almost exactly the criticism the eventual film would receive once it was finally released. Even once production finally began in earnest, with Rami Malek cast in the lead role and director Bryan Singer at the helm, the shoot itself became famously troubled. Reports from the set described repeated unexplained absences by Singer, growing tension with cast and crew, and behavior that ultimately led to his firing before filming had even wrapped, with only a few weeks of shooting remaining. Dexter Fletcher, who would later go on to direct Rocketman the following year, was brought in to finish the film, working from Singer's existing footage and completing the production under considerable time pressure. Under the rules of the Directors Guild of America, only one director's name could appear in the credits for a single feature, and Singer, having shot the larger share of the film before his departure, retained sole directing credit, despite Fletcher having completed a meaningful portion of the production himself, including, by several accounts, some of the film's most pivotal scenes. None of that behind-the-scenes turbulence was visible to the audiences who eventually filled cinemas in the autumn of 2018, who experienced only the finished, seamless product. 20 minutes of Wembley Stadium rebuilt with such precision that longtime Queen fans have described watching it feeling less like cinema and more like time travel. But it's a useful reminder, tucked away in the quieter corners of this story, that even the projects that eventually come to define an entire genre, that establish the template a dozen subsequent films will follow, rarely arrive smoothly. Bohemian Rhapsody very nearly did not get made at all, in any of the several forms it was almost made in over the preceding decade. And even once it finally did, it very nearly collapsed partway through its own production. It succeeded anyway, and in succeeding opened a door that an entire industry has now spent the better part of a decade walking through, one legendary musician at a time. To understand that hunger, it helps to step back and look at what was happening to the way people experienced music and culture more broadly around 2018. This was deep into the streaming era. Spotify had, by then, fundamentally changed the relationship most people had with music, turning it from something you owned, something physical you held and chose deliberately, into something ambient, algorithmically suggested, endlessly available, and therefore strangely weightless. A song could arrive in a personalized playlist next to 1,000 other songs, curated by a system that knew your listening habits better than most of your friends did, and disappear from your attention just as quickly. Music was everywhere, and because it was everywhere, it had, for a great many listeners, stopped feeling like an event. Compare that to the world Freddie Mercury actually lived and performed in. Queen albums were physical objects that fans saved money for and waited in line to buy on release day. A performance like Live Aid was not something you could queue up later at your convenience. It happened once, at a specific hour, watched simultaneously by an audience that has been estimated at somewhere close to 2 billion people across more than 100 countries, all experiencing the same 17 minutes at the same time, with no ability to pause, skip, or rewatch until, if ever, it eventually made its way onto television again. That kind of communal, unrepeatable, appointment-based cultural experience was already rare by 1985. By 2018, for most people under the age of 30, it was almost unimaginable. This is a thread we have pulled on before on this channel, in a different context, thinking about how appointment television used to gather entire households and entire office break rooms around the same broadcast moment, and how streaming eventually dissolved that shared clock. Music went through its own version of that same dissolution just earlier and more completely. And so when Bohemian Rhapsody rebuilt with astonishing technical precision 20 minutes of a stadium concert that had actually happened, in front of an actual crowd, at an actual specific moment in history, it was not just showing audiences a great performance. It was handing them back something the algorithm-driven, on-demand version of culture had quietly taken away. The feeling of being one person in a crowd of many, all moved by the exact same thing, at the exact same time, together. That feeling turned out to be extraordinarily marketable. And once Hollywood confirmed it was marketable, the wave began in earnest. Rocket Man arrived less than a year after Bohemian Rhapsody, in the spring of 2019, telling the story of Elton John, or rather, Reginald Dwight, the shy piano prodigy from a difficult home who invented Elton John as an act of self-creation almost as elaborate as any stage costume he ever wore. Where Bohemian Rhapsody had stayed close to conventional biographical realism, adding musical sequences that felt grounded in something like documentary truth, Rocketman went in a different direction entirely, staging Elton John's life as an outright musical fantasy, complete with dream sequences, gravity-defying dance numbers, and songs performed years before Elton John actually wrote them, repositioned to serve the emotional truth of a moment in his life rather than its chronological accuracy. Critics who had wanted Bohemian Rhapsody to take more risks got exactly what they were asking for with Rocketman, and largely rewarded it, even though its box office, while healthy, never came close to matching Bohemian Rhapsody's numbers. Elton John himself, unlike many of the subjects whose stories get this treatment, was alive and closely involved as an executive producer, and made a notable choice to let the film show his struggles with addiction, his complicated relationships with his parents, and his sexuality, without the kind of softening that had been leveled as a criticism against the Mercury film. Then came Elvis in the summer of 2022, directed by Baz Luhrmann in his signature maximalist style. Rhinestones, rapid editing, a soundtrack that deliberately collided classic Elvis recordings with contemporary hip-hop, as if daring the audience to feel the through line between 1956 and now. What made Elvis structurally unusual, compared to nearly every other film in this wave, was its choice of narrator and point of view. The story is told not from Elvis Presley's own perspective, but through the eyes of his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, played by Tom Hanks under heavy prosthetics and an accent that divided critics almost as sharply as the film's visual style did. That choice reframed the entire film as, in some ways, a story about exploitation, about how a genuinely dazzling talent can be managed, packaged, and slowly drained by the very people who made his stardom possible in the first place. Austin Butler's performance as Elvis was singled out by nearly every critic who otherwise had reservations about the film, and it launched him into a different tier of stardom almost overnight, in exactly the kind of transformation-driven, awards-attention career boost that has become one of this entire genre's most reliable side effects. Rami Malek won an Academy Award for playing Freddie Mercury. Austin Butler was nominated for playing Elvis. Playing a beloved musician convincingly enough has become, in the space of less than a decade, one of the more dependable routes to serious acting recognition in Hollywood. Whitney Houston's story arrived the following year. In Whitney Houston, I Want to Dance with Somebody, tracing her journey from a teenager discovered by music executive Clive Davis through to the vocal peaks that made her one of the most technically extraordinary singers of her generation, and toward the difficulties of her later years. Bob Marley, One Love followed, made with the close involvement of Marley's family. His son Ziggy served as both producer and creative consultant, an arrangement that gave the film an unusual level of access and endorsement, while also raising, for some critics, familiar questions about how much a story shaped by a subject's own estate can afford to show the harder edges of that subject's life. And this year, Michael Jackson, played by his nephew Joffer Jackson, opened in cinemas carrying more built-in tension than perhaps any film in this entire wave. Michael Jackson's legacy, unlike Freddie Mercury's or Elton John's or even Whitney Houston's, is not simply complicated by struggles with addiction or difficult family relationships. It carries serious, unresolved allegations that a significant portion of the public has never stopped grappling with, and that no biopic, however carefully made, can fully sidestep without inviting accusations of whitewashing. And yet, despite all of that, or perhaps because the controversy itself kept the film in constant conversation, Michael became the second highest-grossing music biopic ever made, trailing only Bohemian Rhapsody and pulling in numbers that dwarfed Elvis, Rocketman, and Bob Marley. One Love combined with Room to Spare. Whatever else can be said about that outcome, it confirms something important about this entire genre. Audiences are not necessarily choosing these films because the subject's life was uncomplicated or comfortable to sit with. In some cases, quite the opposite. They are choosing them because the music itself, the cultural footprint, the sheer scale of what these figures once meant to the world, still pulls harder than any discomfort about the life behind it. Somewhere in among all of this, Bob Dylan got his film too, a complete unknown, with Timothy Chalamet spending years learning to sing and play guitar convincingly enough to carry the role himself, rather than lip-sync to original recordings, tracing Dylan's controversial shift from acoustic folk purist to the electric sound that famously got him booed at the Newport Folk Festival. And Bruce Springsteen's story, Deliver Me From Nowhere, followed not long after, with Jeremy Allen White taking on the role. An actor who, coincidentally or not, has spent recent years becoming one of the defining faces of a certain kind of intense, wounded American masculinity on screen. First in a very different kind of story about a chaotic Chicago kitchen, and now here, in a story about an artist retreating from the pressures of stardom to make one of the starkest, most stripped-down albums of his career. Look at that list end to end, and a pattern becomes hard to miss. Queen, Elton John, Elvis Presley, Whitney Houston, Bob Marley, Michael Jackson, Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen. Every single one of these is not simply a successful musician, but a genuinely, inarguably era-defining one. An artist whose name means something even to people who could not name a single one of their songs, whose image alone functions as cultural shorthand for an entire decade or an entire genre. Hollywood, having discovered that this particular formula works, has not been reaching for minor or forgotten figures to fill it. It has been working systematically through a list of the most universally recognized musical icons of the 20th century. one after another, as though checking names off of a registry of people whose stories were simply waiting for their turn. And that raises the real question underneath all of this. Not why any single one of these films succeeded. Each has its own specific reasons, its own strong central performance, its own marketing campaign. But why an entire industry decided, starting with Freddie Mercury in 2018, that this was the moment to systematically mine the 20th century's musical mythology for the big screen all at once, in such rapid and deliberate succession? There are a few different answers to that question, and none of them fully explains the phenomenon on its own. But together, they start to paint a fairly complete picture. The first answer is generational, and in its way, quite practical. The people who actually lived through Queen's rise, or Elton John's 70s imperial phase, or Elvis at his peak, are now old enough that the industry executives greenlighting these films are, in many cases, their own children. The generation that grew up with these artists' music playing in the family car, or on a parent's record player, without necessarily choosing it themselves. That generation is now old enough to hold real decision-making power in film financing, and they are, consciously or not, reaching back for the cultural inheritance of their own childhoods and putting it on screen for a new mass audience. There is a particular kind of emotional charge that comes from watching your parents' music, the soundtrack of your own early memories, treated with the scale and reverence of a big-budget prestige film, rather than left to fade quietly into the past as your parents' music, the way earlier generations' cultural touchstones so often did. The second answer has to do with how streaming platforms themselves changed the economics and visibility of older music catalogs in ways almost nobody predicted a decade earlier. When a biopic succeeds, it does not just sell movie tickets. It sends an enormous, immediate spike of new listeners to the artist's back catalog on every streaming service simultaneously. After Bohemian Rhapsody's release, Queen's streaming numbers didn't just tick upward. They surged, with entire younger cohorts of listeners discovering songs that were, in some cases, older than their own parents, and treating them not as nostalgia, but as something closer to a new discovery. This created an obvious and repeatable financial incentive that had simply not existed in quite the same form before streaming made an artist's entire back catalog instantly available, everywhere, the moment a film reignited interest in them. A biopic is now, among other things, one of the most efficient marketing tools an estate or a record label can deploy for a catalog that might otherwise slowly recede from cultural memory as the generations who remember the original context age out of the conversation. The third answer is more emotional, and probably the one that matters most for understanding why audiences, not just studio executives, kept showing up. We are living through an era that has, by nearly every measure available, become more fragmented in how people experience culture than at almost any point in modern history. Streaming didn't just change music. It changed television, as we've touched on before regarding the last era of appointment viewing. It changed how people discover movies, how they consume news, how they even discover each other's opinions, with algorithms increasingly sorting each person into their own personalized feed, their own bubble of recommendations, their own version of what is popular or important, invisible to the person sitting next to them on the same couch. In that context, there is something genuinely rare and valuable about a cultural artifact, a film, or the concert footage it recreates, that still has the power to gather a truly mass audience around a single shared emotional experience, the way Live Aid itself once did.
The way a new album release used to when it was still an event rather than an addition to an infinite, ever-scrolling queue.
Freddie Mercury, more than almost any other musician of his era, built his entire artistic identity around exactly that kind of collective, in-person, unrepeatable moment. He was, by the near universal agreement of critics, musicians, and audiences who experienced him live, one of the greatest frontmen in the history of rock music, specifically because of his mastery of the stadium as an instrument in itself. Not just performing to a crowd of tens of thousands, but performing with them, conducting call-and-response vocal exercises that stretched his voice and the crowd's collective voice across distances that should have made that kind of intimacy impossible, and somehow didn't. Anecdotes from musicians who shared stages with him describe an almost unnerving ability to make a stadium of strangers feel, briefly, like a single organism responding to a single will. That skill, that specific and rare gift, is precisely the thing that a fragmented, on-demand, algorithmically individualized culture had quietly stopped being able to offer its audiences on a regular basis. And so when a film came along that could recreate frame by frame, second by second, 20 minutes of exactly that kind of collective transcendence, it landed with a force that had less to do with nostalgia for Freddie Mercury specifically, and more to do with a kind of ambient cultural hunger that had been building, mostly unnoticed, for years. There is also a simpler explanation sitting alongside all of these larger cultural forces, one worth naming honestly rather than dressing up in theory. These are, on a very basic level, just good stories, built from real lives that already contain everything a screenwriter could want. Genuine hardship, genuine triumph, real stakes, real risk, and music embedded in the story that the audience already loves before the film even begins, meaning the emotional work of getting an audience to care about a character has, in some sense, already been done for the filmmaker decades before they ever picked up the project. That is an enormous structural advantage that an entirely original story simply does not have. An audience walking into Bohemian Rhapsody already loved We Will Rock You and Somebody to Love before the lights went down. The film's job was never to make people care about the music. It was only to make people feel something new about the man who made it. Let's turn now gently to the man himself. Not to relitigate every detail of a life that has already been documented exhaustively elsewhere, but to sit with the parts of his story that explain why, of everyone Hollywood could have chosen to build this entire genre around, it was Freddie Mercury, who became its founding figure. He was born Farrokh Bulsara in September of 1946 on the island of Zanzibar, off the coast of East Africa, to Parsi parents who had roots in India and who worked for the British colonial civil service. His early childhood moved between cultures in a way that would have been unusual for almost anyone in that era. Raised partly in Zanzibar, sent to boarding school in India as a young boy, immersed early in both Western pop music arriving via radio and the Parsi Zoroastrian religious traditions of his family, a heritage rooted in ancient Persia and preserved by a small, tightly knit diaspora community. By the time he was a teenager, he had already shown a serious aptitude for piano and had started, informally, performing in school bands, absorbing Little Richard and Elvis Presley and the British rock acts just beginning to define what popular music could sound like. Then, in 1964, when he was 17, his family's life was upended by political violence. The Zanzibar Revolution, a sudden and brutal uprising against the ruling Arab minority, made life for the island's Indian and Parsi communities suddenly, seriously dangerous. Along with thousands of others, the Bulsara family fled, arriving in England as refugees with very little beyond what they could carry, settling in a modest house near Feltham, outside London. Farrokh was, by that point, already going by Freddie among friends, a name that had followed him from his school days in India, but arriving in England as a teenage refugee, in a country still working through its own complicated relationship with its former colonial subjects, meant starting over completely. New school, new social codes, an accent and appearance that marked him immediately as an outsider in a country that was not always kind to outsiders in that period. It is difficult to overstate how much this early experience of displacement, of building an entirely new identity from nothing in an unfamiliar country, seems to have shaped everything that came afterward. Nearly everyone who has studied his life closely, biographers, bandmates, close friends, has pointed to the same pattern. Freddie Mercury did not simply adopt a stage name the way many performers casually do. He constructed, with extraordinary deliberateness, an entirely new persona, one that had almost nothing visible in common with the shy, private immigrant teenager underneath it. On stage, Freddie Mercury was fearless, flamboyant, commanding, seemingly incapable of self-doubt. Offstage, according to nearly everyone who actually knew him, he remained for his entire life genuinely private, protective of his personal world, and by several accounts considerably shyer in small groups than the scale of his stage persona would ever suggest. That gap between the constructed public figure and the guarded private man is in many ways the single most consistent theme running through every serious account of his life. And it is precisely the theme that the biopic wave, for all its dramatic license, keeps returning to across nearly every one of its subjects. Reginald Dwight becoming Elton John, Robert Zimmerman becoming Bob Dylan, a shy piano prodigy from a difficult household becoming, through nothing but sheer will and talent, someone the whole world would eventually recognize on sight. He studied graphic art and design at Ealing Art College in West London in the late 1960s, training that would later show up unmistakably in the elaborate visual language he brought to Queen's album covers, stage design, and even the band's now famous crest, which he designed himself, combining the astrological symbols of each band member into a single, deliberately regal emblem. A small early clue, long before the band had any real fame to justify it, that Freddie Mercury was already thinking in terms of legacy, of mythology, of how the group's image would be read and remembered. He met guitarist Brian May and drummer Roger Taylor around 1970, when both were playing in a band called Smile, and after Smile's original singer departed, Freddie, not yet using the surname Mercury, pushed his way into the group with a level of confidence that, by nearly every account from that period, surprised the other members. He suggested the new band name almost immediately, Queen. Both May and Taylor have said in later interviews that they were initially uneasy about it. It felt bold to the point of arrogance for a band with no record deal, no real following, nothing yet to justify a name that grand. Freddie's response, reportedly, was some version of the idea that the name should not describe what the band currently was, but what it was going to become. It is the kind of story that sounds almost too perfectly foreshadowing in retrospect, the sort of detail a screenwriter would invent if it hadn't actually happened. But multiple independent accounts from people in the room at the time confirm some version of it did. Bassist John Deacon joined in 1971, completing the lineup that would remain unchanged for the next 2 decades, an unusual stability in an industry defined by lineup changes, breakups, and reunions. The band spent its early years playing small venues, recording an ambitious but commercially underwhelming debut album, and slowly building the kind of reputation among fellow musicians and critics, for musicianship, for genuinely unusual compositional ambition, that did not yet translate into mainstream commercial success. Queen's early sound resisted easy categorization from the very start, blending hard rock guitar work with elaborate vocal harmonies borrowed more from choral and operatic traditions than from anything happening in rock music at the time, along with a theatrical, almost Baroque sense of arrangement that set them apart from, and initially made them harder to market than, more straightforwardly categorizable contemporaries. That resistance to easy categorization reached its fullest expression in 1975, with the release of Bohemian Rhapsody itself. The song, not the film, though the film of course takes its title directly from it. At nearly 6 minutes long, structured as an operatic suite with no repeating chorus, shifting through a ballad section, a mock operatic middle passage layered with hundreds of overdubbed vocal harmonies recorded over painstaking weeks, and a hard rock coda, it violated essentially every rule of what a commercial single was supposed to be in the mid-1970s. EMI, the band's record label, reportedly resisted releasing it as a single at all, on the grounds that radio would never play something nearly twice the length of a typical single, and structured nothing like conventional pop songwriting. The story, retold so many times it has become part of the band's own mythology, is that Freddie personally gave an early copy to a friend who was a prominent London radio DJ, who then played it on air repeatedly over a single weekend, effectively forcing the label's hand by generating enough public demand that they had no real choice but to release it. Whether every detail of that story is precisely accurate, the way it is usually told, the underlying fact is not in dispute. The song broke essentially every convention of commercial radio and became, against every industry expectation, one of the best-selling singles in British chart history, holding the record for the UK's best-selling single of all time for over a decade, and returning to the top of the charts again in 1991, the week after Freddie Mercury's death, an eerie symmetry that closed the loop on his career almost too neatly. Across the following decade, Queen built a catalog and a reputation that, in retrospect, look almost absurdly overstuffed with songs that would go on to become genuine cultural standards, sung at football stadiums and weddings and karaoke bars decades later by people with no particular interest in rock music history. We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions, released back-to-back in 1977, were written deliberately, according to Brian May's later accounts, to give audiences something to participate in physically. The stomp-stomp-clap rhythm of We Will Rock You was designed from the outset to be performed by a crowd, not just a band. Another example of Freddie and the band's instinct for turning a passive audience into active participants in the performance itself, the same instinct that would later define his legendary stage presence. By the early 1980s, Queen had become one of the biggest touring acts in the world, and Freddie Mercury had become, by wide critical consensus, one of popular music's defining live performers. A reputation built not primarily on studio recordings, but on what happened when he walked onto a stage in front of tens of thousands of people. Musicians who performed alongside him, or watched him from the wings, have described a quality that is difficult to capture in any single anecdote, but that shows up, remarkably consistently, across dozens of separate accounts. An ability to fill a stadium the way most performers can barely fill a small club, to make eye contact, or the illusion of it, with tens of thousands of people simultaneously, and to conduct a crowd's collective voice with the same precision a conductor brings to an orchestra. Which brings us back, in a sense, to where we began tonight, to that one specific afternoon in July of 1985, when all of that accumulated skill, 2 decades of building an identity, a voice, a stage presence, a band, a catalog of songs the whole world already half knew by heart, converged in a single 20-minute set at Wembley Stadium, broadcast to an estimated worldwide audience of nearly 2 billion people in aid of famine relief in Ethiopia. Queen's Live Aid performance is now, by the near-unanimous judgment of critics, musicians, and polls of the public conducted in the decades since, considered one of the greatest live performances in the history of popular music, not simply for its technical execution, though that was flawless under enormous pressure and severe time constraints, but for the sheer, almost unrepeatable quality of connection Freddie Mercury achieved with a crowd of that size in that short a window of time. The famous I.O. vocal call-and-response section, where he sang a single sustained note and 72,000 people echoed it back to him, growing progressively more elaborate as the exchange continued, has become one of the most studied, most replayed, most imitated moments in concert history. A small, spontaneous-seeming piece of showmanship that was, according to those who knew him, actually the product of a performer who had spent his entire career learning, almost scientifically, exactly how to make a stadium feel like an intimate room. He would live for 6 more years after that performance. In November of 1991, just 1 day after publicly confirming that he had AIDS, having kept his diagnosis largely private for years out of a combination of personal preference and the very real fear of the stigma and media intrusion that a public announcement would have unleashed in that era, he died at his home in London, at the age of 45. The scale of public grief that followed, in Britain and around the world, surprised even close observers of his career, a testament, many said at the time, to just how much larger his music and his stage presence had grown in the public imagination than the relatively private man who had guarded so much of his personal life so carefully throughout his career. Before we drift further toward the close of tonight's story, it's worth spending a little more time with something the films in this genre, including Freddie Mercury's own, tend to compress almost out of existence in the interest of running time. The sheer, restless musical range Queen actually covered across their career, and how central that range was to why critics, for much of the band's active life, struggled to know quite what to make of them. After the operatic ambition of Bohemian Rhapsody and the album that housed it, 1975's A Night at the Opera, the band followed with A Day at the Races the next year, continuing in a similarly lush, layered direction, before pivoting in 1977 towards something far more stripped down and stadium-ready with News of the World, the album that gave the world both We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions within the same handful of tracks. 2 songs so different in construction and mood from the operatic multi-part suites of 2 years earlier, that it can be hard to believe they came from the same band in the same decade. Then, in 1980, Queen pivoted again, this time toward disco and funk with Another One Bites the Dust, a bass-line-driven single written primarily by John Deacon that became, somewhat to the band's own surprise, one of their biggest-selling songs in the United States, played constantly on radio formats that had shown little previous interest in a band most closely associated with elaborate rock theatrics. That restlessness, that refusal to settle into one identifiable sound the way many of their most commercially successful contemporaries did, made Queen a genuinely difficult band for critics to categorize consistently, and for much of the 1970s and into the 1980s, a fair amount of music journalism treated them with real skepticism. Accusations of being overproduced, of prioritizing spectacle over substance, of chasing commercial trends rather than following any coherent artistic vision. Rolling Stone's original review of A Night at the Opera, now remembered as one of the most significant rock albums of the decade, was notably lukewarm at the time of release. It would take decades and a considerable amount of critical reassessment for Queen's catalog to be widely recognized by the same kind of publications that had once been skeptical as one of the more genuinely inventive and structurally ambitious bodies of work in the history of rock music, rather than simply a singles-driven arena act with an unusually theatrical frontman. Freddie Mercury's own restlessness extended beyond the band itself. In 1987, he released an entire solo album, Barcelona, in collaboration with the celebrated Spanish operatic soprano Montserrat Caballé, a genuinely unusual project for a rock star at the height of stadium fame to pursue, blending his own voice directly with formal operatic technique in a way that had no obvious commercial logic behind it at all, and that seemed motivated almost entirely by Freddie's own long-standing, well-documented love of opera, a passion that had already surfaced in a more theatrical and populist form within the operatic midsection of Bohemian Rhapsody itself more than a decade earlier. The title track, later adopted as one of the official anthems of the 1992 Barcelona Olympics, performed shortly before his death by a recording of Caballé alongside archival footage of Freddie, became, in its own quiet way, one more example of the same pattern that runs through nearly everything else in his career. An artist who kept finding new, sometimes genuinely unexpected ways to reach audiences who might never otherwise have crossed paths with rock music at all. By the mid-1980s, and especially after Live Aid, Queen's commercial standing, particularly in the United States, had actually become somewhat complicated by a controversial 1982 album called Hot Space, which leaned heavily into a dance and funk-influenced sound that alienated a significant portion of the band's traditional rock audience and drew some of the harshest reviews of the band's career at the time. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it complicates the tidy, triumphant version of the story the films tend to tell. Queen were not simply an unbroken chain of massive successes from the mid-1970s through Freddie's death. There were genuine commercial stumbles, genuine periods of critical dismissal, genuine uncertainty within the band itself about whether they had lost the audience that had once filled stadiums for them. Live Aid, in that context, was not just a triumphant highlight reel moment. It was, by several members' own later accounts, something closer to a genuine reclamation, a chance in front of the largest possible audience to remind the world, and perhaps to remind themselves, of exactly what they were capable of after a stretch of years in which that had become, for the first time in the band's career, genuinely uncertain. That context matters, quietly, for understanding why the Live Aid performance carries the emotional weight it does, both in the historical record and in the film built around it. It was not simply a great band having a great night. It was a band with something to prove, on the world's largest possible stage, delivering exactly the performance the moment demanded, at precisely the point in their career when they most needed it to land. What has happened to Freddie Mercury's legacy in the 35 years since his death is, in its own way, almost as remarkable a story as his rise to fame in the first place. Most musical legacies, even substantial ones, tend to follow a fairly predictable arc. Intense mourning and tribute in the years immediately following an artist's death, a steady decline in mainstream cultural presence as the following decades pass, and eventually a kind of settled status as a respected but no longer actively expanding part of music history, kept alive mainly by dedicated longtime fans and the occasional anniversary retrospective. Freddie Mercury's legacy did not follow that arc. If anything, it has done something closer to the opposite, growing in cultural presence with each passing decade rather than receding. Part of that has to do with a decision the surviving members of Queen made that was, at the time, genuinely controversial among longtime fans. Rather than quietly winding the band down after Freddie's death, or preserving it purely as a nostalgia act performing only the old catalog with a rotating cast of guest vocalists, Brian May and Roger Taylor eventually made the choice to tour again, extensively, with a new frontman taking on lead vocals, first briefly with Paul Rodgers, formerly of Bad Company and Free, and then starting in 2011 with Adam Lambert, an American singer who had first come to wide public attention as a runner-up on a television singing competition. The pairing of Queen with Adam Lambert struck many longtime fans, at first, as a strange and possibly disrespectful choice, an attempt to replace an utterly irreplaceable frontman with a talent show contestant decades younger, fronting one of the most demanding vocal catalogs in rock history. What actually happened defied nearly everyone's expectations, including, by his own repeated public admission, Lambert's own. Rather than attempting a straightforward Freddie Mercury impression, which nearly everyone agreed would have been a doomed strategy from the start, Lambert developed his own distinct interpretation of the songs, honoring the original arrangements and vocal melodies while bringing his own phrasing, his own stage presence, his own relationship to the material. Queen plus Adam Lambert has, in the years since, become one of the highest-grossing touring acts in the world, repeatedly selling out arenas and stadiums across multiple continents, performing to audiences that include people who never saw the original band with Freddie Mercury at all, sitting alongside people who did decades ago, sharing the same show, the same songs, in a way that very few classic rock acts of that era have managed to sustain into the present. That touring afterlife is only one strand of how the Freddie Mercury and Queen legacy has continued expanding rather than contracting. In 2002, We Will Rock You, a stage musical built around Queen's catalog and featuring a loose, deliberately campy science fiction plot, largely unconnected to the band's actual history, opened in London's West End. Critics were, with some consistency, unkind to it. The plot was widely dismissed as flimsy, an excuse to string together Queen's greatest hits in a live theatrical setting rather than any serious attempt at storytelling. Audiences, however, disagreed almost entirely with the critics and disagreed for over a decade. The show ran in London for more than 12 years, one of the longest-running musicals in West End history, and toured internationally to audiences numbering in the millions, becoming, in its own commercially enormous way, another data point in the same pattern the later films would confirm, that there is a vast, durable audience for experiencing Freddie Mercury's music live, communally, in a room full of strangers singing along to the same songs, regardless of how thin the surrounding narrative dressing might be. There is also something worth noting about how Queen's music specifically has aged, compared to many of their contemporaries, in terms of its actual presence in ordinary people's lives, well outside the context of dedicated fandom or nostalgia programming. We Are the Champions is sung, largely unself-consciously, at sporting events around the world by crowds who may know almost nothing else about the band. Bohemian Rhapsody itself experienced a well-documented surge back into mainstream youth culture in 1992, entirely unplanned, when it was used memorably in the film Wayne's World, introducing the song to an entire generation of teenagers who had not been alive, or had been very young children, when it was originally released. A strange, unpredictable second life for a 17-year-old song, driven by a comedy film rather than any conscious effort at legacy management. The song would go on to have a third major resurgence, an entirely different kind, when the 2018 biopic sent it back to the top of streaming charts worldwide, 35 years and 43 years after its original recording. If you happen to know people who work in the live events or touring industry, as some listeners of this channel do, you may already have encountered a version of this pattern firsthand. The way Freddie Mercury and Queen have become something closer to an evergreen category within live entertainment and tourism than a fixed piece of history confined to the 1970s and 80s. Tribute tours, exhibitions, guided walks past his former homes in London, and themed experiences built around his life and music continue to draw steady interest, not from a shrinking pool of original-era fans slowly aging out of the audience, but increasingly from younger visitors who came to him through the film, through Queen and Adam Lambert's arena tours, through a viral clip of Bohemian Rhapsody, or the Live Aid performance surfacing yet again on some platform that did not exist when either of those things originally happened. It is a genuinely unusual thing in the history of popular music for an artist's commercial and cultural relevance to keep finding new on-ramps, new entry points for new generations, 3.5 decades after that artist's death, rather than gradually fading into the specialized territory of dedicated archivists and completists. Part of the explanation, inevitably, circles back to the same core observation that opened this entire train of thought tonight, that Freddie Mercury built his career, more deliberately and more successfully than perhaps any other performer of his era, around the creation of collective, communal, unrepeatable moments. Studio recordings, however brilliant, can only ever be a record of a performance. What Freddie Mercury seems to have understood, instinctively and then with growing sophistication as his career progressed, is that the live performance itself, the shared experience of thousands of strangers becoming briefly a single responsive crowd, was where his particular genius actually lived. Every subsequent iteration of his legacy, the touring band with a new frontman, the jukebox musical built loosely around his catalog, the biopic constructed around a recreation of his single greatest concert, the modern experiences and tours built around his life story, has been, in its own way, an attempt to recreate or at least gesture toward that same kind of communal moment. None of them can fully replace what happened at Wembley in July of 1985, in front of that specific crowd, at that specific hour, broadcast to that specific global audience who will never again be gathered in quite the same way around a single unrepeatable television event. But each of them, in its own way, tries. There is one more thread worth pulling gently at before we let this story rest, because once you notice it, it becomes hard to unsee across nearly every film in this entire wave. Almost without exception, the figures Hollywood has chosen to resurrect on screen were, in some significant way, outsiders before they were icons. Freddie Mercury arrived in England as a teenage refugee from a political upheaval half a world away, carrying a name and a heritage that marked him as different in a country still working through deep uncertainties about race, immigration, and empire. Elton John, born Reginald Dwight, grew up a gay man in a country where homosexuality had only recently been decriminalized, in a household his own accounts describe as emotionally difficult, finding in music one of the only outlets where the person he actually was could be fully expressed. Freddie Mercury, too, lived much of his life navigating a sexuality that mainstream British culture of his era was, for most of his career, deeply unwilling to accept openly. Something the earlier film adaptation of his life was itself criticized for treating with more caution and ambiguity than his actual lived experience. Ray Charles lost his sight as a young child and grew up in the segregated American South, building a career that would eventually cross and blend genre and racial lines that the music industry of his era worked hard to keep separate. Bob Marley grew up in rural Jamaica, the mixed-race son of a black mother and a white father who was largely absent from his life, navigating a colonial society's rigid ideas about race and class from both directions at once, before becoming one of the only musicians from a small island nation to achieve genuinely global, planet-spanning fame. Whitney Houston, extraordinary a talent as she was, spent much of her career navigating a music industry and a broader American culture that scrutinized and second-guessed a black woman's authenticity and choices in ways her white contemporaries were rarely subjected to in the same way. Johnny Cash grew up in genuine rural poverty in Depression-era Arkansas, one of several children in a family working cotton fields, a background about as far from the eventual scale of his fame as it is possible to imagine. None of this is coincidental, and it is not simply that outsiders happen to make compelling movie subjects, though that is certainly true as far as it goes. It points to something a little deeper about what these films are actually offering audiences, underneath the concert recreations and the awards-friendly, transformative performances. Each one is, at its core, a story about a person who did not fit the world they were born into, who found, through talent and sheer persistence, a way to build an entirely new place for themselves within it, one large enough and loud enough that the world had no choice but to make room. That is an unusually reassuring story to tell and retell, again and again, in an era when so many people, for entirely different and far more ordinary reasons than international stardom, still feel like they do not quite fit the world as it currently exists around them. Freddie Mercury, in that sense, may be the purest, most legible version of that particular story that this entire genre has yet produced, which perhaps helps explain, beyond all of the streaming economics and generational nostalgia we've already spent some time with tonight, why it was his story specifically that ended up opening the door for all the others. A refugee, an immigrant, a man building an entirely new identity, an entirely new name, an entirely new persona out of very little in a country that did not obviously want him. And then, decade 2000 Stranium, rocking Theo, singing his words back to him, in a single unbroken, unified voice. It is worth sitting with, too, how strange and quietly moving it is that this particular story, of an outsider building an entirely new self through sheer will and talent, keeps finding new audiences precisely because the tools for telling it keep changing. Live Aid was, for its own moment, the largest simultaneous broadcast audience in television history, gathered around a single, unrepeatable event. Decades later, a film could recreate 20 minutes of that same event with such technical precision that it moved audiences who had never seen the original broadcast at all, most of whom were watching on a screen far smaller than a cinema, on a phone, weeks or months after the film's theatrical release, having found a clip of it through an algorithm that had no concept of Freddie Mercury or Queen or 1985, but simply noticed that people kept watching this particular 20 minutes of footage all the way to the end, and kept recommending it to more people as a result. The mechanism for how the moment travels keeps changing entirely, generation after generation. Technology, after technology. What it is actually offering the person on the other end of the screen, whatever screen that happens to be, has stayed remarkably constant the whole time. One more pattern worth noting, quietly, before we let this whole story settle. Across nearly every film in this wave, there has been a fairly consistent gap between how critics received them and how audiences did. Bohemian Rhapsody's reviews from professional critics were, on the whole, distinctly mixed. Plenty of praise for Rami Malek's performance and the Live Aid recreation specifically, alongside real frustration at the film's historical liberties and its narrower, more sanitized treatment of Freddie's personal life. Audience response, measured through ticket sales and audience polling, was overwhelmingly, almost uniformly positive, to a degree that noticeably outpaced the critical consensus. That same gap shows up again with Elvis, again with Bob Marley. One Love, again, most dramatically of all, with Michael, a film that arrived carrying more unresolved public controversy than perhaps any biopic in modern memory, and that critics approached with considerably more caution than audiences ultimately showed at the box office. It would be easy to read that recurring gap cynically, as evidence that audiences simply do not care about historical accuracy or moral complexity as long as the music sounds good and the concert scenes are staged well. There is probably some truth in that. But there is another way to read the same pattern, one that fits more comfortably with everything else this story has touched on tonight. Critics, by the nature of their job, tend to evaluate these films as biographies, as attempts at truthfully rendering a specific, complicated human life, and they judge them, reasonably, by how honestly and rigorously they manage that task. Audiences, it seems, are often engaging with something slightly different, something closer to communal ritual than biography, an opportunity to sit together in a dark room and feel, collectively, the emotional scale of a body of music that already means something enormous to them, regardless of how faithfully the surrounding narrative details are rendered. Judged as biography, several of these films have real, legitimate shortcomings. Judged as a 2-hour ritual designed to let a room full of strangers feel something together about music they already love, most of them succeed overwhelmingly at exactly what they set out to do. It's worth remembering, too, underneath all the box office analysis and critical debate, that Freddie Mercury was, by every account from the people who actually shared his daily life, rather than his stadium performances, someone capable of remarkable warmth in small private moments, someone who kept cats throughout his adult life and, according to his longtime partner and several friends, would sometimes phone home from tour stops around the world specifically to check in on them. Someone whose close friends describe not the towering, larger-than-life stage figure the world remembers, but a genuinely generous, funny, occasionally shy man who valued the small, steady circle of people he trusted completely, in sharp and deliberate contrast to the tens of thousands of strangers he could command effortlessly from a stage. That contrast, gentle as it is, feels like a fitting place to let this story rest for tonight. Not the stadium, not the record charts, just a quiet home, a small trusted circle, a private warmth that never needed 72,000 people to feel real. There is a small, almost poetic irony in how much of Freddie Mercury's ongoing rediscovery by younger audiences now happens through exactly the kind of algorithmic, on-demand system that this whole story suggested he was, in some sense, a reaction against. The Live Aid performance, or clips of it, circulate constantly on short-form video platforms, resurfacing not because anyone scheduled them, not because a broadcaster chose to air them at a specific hour, but because a recommendation system somewhere noticed that people who start watching tend to keep watching and keep sharing, and quietly decided to keep pushing the same 20-year-old and 40-year-old footage in front of new eyes, over and over indefinitely. The very same mechanism that fragmented collective culture into millions of individually tailored feeds turns out to be remarkably good when it stumbles onto something with this much raw power in it, at reassembling small pockets of that same collective experience, one algorithmically nudged viewer at a time, even if none of them are actually watching together in the same room, at the same hour, the way that original crowd at Wembley was. Maybe that is the quiet, unglamorous truth sitting underneath this entire wave of films, stripped of the box office numbers and the award season narratives. The specific mechanism for gathering an audience around a shared feeling keeps changing and will keep changing, probably for as long as there is culture at all to distribute. A live broadcast, a film in a cinema, a clip recommended by an algorithm at 1 a.m. to someone who cannot sleep. But the underlying hunger for a moment that feels bigger than any one person watching alone does not seem to be going anywhere at all. So let's return gently to the question this whole story has been circling since the beginning. Why do we do this? Why does an industry and an audience keep reaching back into the past over and over to resurrect people who are no longer here to ask for it, to reassemble their most triumphant moments with a level of technical craft and emotional investment that sometimes exceeds anything given to entirely new, entirely original stories? Part of the answer is almost certainly about mortality itself, though not in a morbid sense. There's something quietly comforting, if you sit with it for a moment, about a culture that keeps insisting certain people should not simply be allowed to fade. Freddie Mercury has now been dead for longer than he was alive as a famous performer, and yet a teenager discovering Queen for the first time this year, through a clip on their phone or a scene from that film, experiences something that is, in its own way, not so different from what a teenager in 1975 felt hearing Bohemian Rhapsody on the radio for the first time. The song has not aged into irrelevance. If anything, each new act of resurrection, a film, a tour with a new frontman, a viral clip, resets the clock in some small way, letting the work reach an audience that relates to it not as a historical artifact to be studied, but as something alive, something current, something that still has the power to genuinely surprise a person who has never encountered it before. There is also, underneath the commercial logic and the generational nostalgia and the streaming economics, something simpler and more universally human going on. We are drawn, it seems, again and again to stories about people who built something extraordinary out of very ordinary, even difficult beginnings. The refugee teenager who became one of the greatest frontmen in the history of popular music. The shy piano prodigy from a troubled home who became one of the most flamboyant performers of his generation. The young man managed and shaped and sold by others who nonetheless found, in front of a crowd, a kind of freedom nobody could take from him. These are, in their bones, old stories, versions of transformation and self-invention that show up across cultures and centuries in myth and folklore long before cinema or recorded music existed at all. The specific details change, the stage costumes, the record contracts, the stadium lighting rigs, but the underlying shape of the story, an unremarkable person finding, through struggle and will, an extraordinary version of themselves, is one of the oldest stories human beings have ever told each other. In every era, around every kind of fire. The wave shows no sign of slowing down either. Even as Michael's box office numbers continue to be tallied and analyzed by an industry eager to understand exactly what worked and why, there are more of these films already moving through development, including, reportedly, a project centered on Ronnie Spector, the pioneering lead singer of the Ronettes, with Zendaya attached to star, under the direction of Barry Jenkins, whose past work suggests this particular entry in the genre may lean towards something quieter and more interior than the stadium-scale spectacle of Bohemian Rhapsody or Elvis. There is also reportedly a large-scale multi-film project about the Beatles, currently in the works from director Sam Mendes, an undertaking of such scale, reportedly planned as 4 separate films, one centered on each individual band member's perspective on the same shared history, that it suggests the entire genre may be entering a new, even more ambitious phase, no longer content to tell one artist's story across a single 2-hour film, but attempting something closer to a sprawling multi-perspective mythology. Whatever comes next in this particular wave of films, it is worth remembering, on a night like this, that it all traces back to one specific choice made by a group of filmmakers working on a Freddie Mercury film in the mid-2010s. The choice to end not with a hospital bed, not with a funeral, not with the quiet tragedy that so many biopics before it had leaned on as their emotional climax, but with a stadium full of people, at the absolute peak of one man's powers, doing the thing he did better than almost anyone else in history. Alive, radiant, in front of the whole world, for one more time. If you are still with me at this point, you have likely been listening for a while now. And if your eyes have grown heavy somewhere in the last stretch of this story, that is exactly as it should be. There is nothing left to follow closely from here. The details of Ronnie Spector's upcoming film, the exact structure of the planned Beatles project, whichever icon Hollywood decides to resurrect next, none of it needs to be remembered by morning. Let it all soften into background now, the way a song fades rather than stops, the individual words losing their sharp edges until only the shape of the voice remains. In a little while, my voice will fade out completely, and what follows will simply be quiet, steady white noise. Nothing to listen for, nothing to follow, Just a soft and even sound to rest inside of as you drift the rest of the way into sleep. There is nowhere else you need to be right now, and nothing else you need to do. Just let go a little more with each breath and let the rest of the night take care of itself. Sleep well.